Cowboy fans here this morning? I know it's a dumb question. It's loaded. I know the answer to it. It's a rhetorical question. How about Texas Longhorn fans? Any Longhorn fans here this morning? Man, after that, yeah. How about any Oklahoma Sooner fans here? Yeah, sorry, buddy. So if you are a fan of any of these teams, and see, I'm not a fan of the Cowboys, and when they beat Pittsburgh last Sunday night, I was upset. I was trying to decide whether I was ever going to come back again or not, because I love Pittsburgh. But if you're a fan, how do people know that you're a fan? Do you tell them that you're a fan when you talk, you have conversations with them? I think if Jim and I have a conversation that lasts more than 5 minutes, we automatically start talking about the sports franchises that we like, or the cars, or even the food that we're fans of. We wear shirts. I don't see anybody with a Texas shirt on this morning, but I know that we've had that in times past, or Dallas Cowboys. You got a Cowboys. You got blue and silver on for today for the Cowboys. Yeah, we wear this. We put stickers on the windows of our cars, and even bumper stickers on there telling people that we're fans, or ball caps, or go to the games, or jackets, or whatever. I mean, there's just any number of things that we can show the world that we're a fan of this particular event or team. As a true fan, you intentionally find ways of identifying with your team, publicly and privately. Now, are there any Christians here this morning? I see one hand going up, and it almost came out of her socket when it went up in the air like that. I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that there were some yeses. I'm glad to see some hands go up. And the question that we have is, as Christians, do other people know that you're a Christian? Do you publicly identify with Christ? Do you publicly identify with his people? Or are you a little more secretive? Now, it's easy to hear on Sunday morning because the rest of the world's asleep. They don't wake up till about noon. They're all usually hungover from whatever. They wake up about noon to watch the ball game. So we can secretly get out of the house on Sunday morning and nobody knows where we are. And we come together here and, oh, this is nice. I'm with my fellow Christians. And as soon as we leave the door, it's, man, how about them Cowboys? If you tend more to the private side, then I think today's message is a great opportunity for us to grow in our faith as Christians, because part of true biblical faith is identifying with Christ and his people. Joseph, if I could go ahead and get you to pull that PowerPoint up. I know we've had a few struggles the last couple of weeks. We're in the process of trying to remedy that. Mike and I spent a little while up here yesterday trying to figure out how to get this done. But what we're going to talk about today is choosing faith. In the same way that we choose sports teams, or we choose the clothes that we wear, we choose the vehicles that we wear, today we're going to learn about choosing faith. You are going to make a choice to display your faith. You're going to make a choice for Christ. If you've got your Bibles open, let's go to Hebrews chapter 11, where we've spent the last 7 weeks. We're going to spend another 4 or 5 before we hit our Advent series after right around the Thanksgiving holiday season. But we're going to read verses today, verses 24 through 26. Now, I'm skipping 23, 27, 28, and 29. That's a whole nother sermon, and maybe we'll get to that down the road. But this week, we're going to focus on verses 24 through 26. And we're going to be talking about Moses. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Faith chooses to identify with, it refuses to identify with the world, no matter what the world offers. And what does the world offer? Fame, fortune, wealth, temptations of power, pleasure. But true biblical faith refuses to identify with the world, even when the world offers you this power, pleasure, and wealth. And I want to take a look at these three things this morning: the power and pleasure and wealth. You see, faith refuses the temptation of worldly power and influence. Moses, as I think most of us are familiar with the story, grew up in Egypt, the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Most of you know the story. Pharaoh had ordered the Israelites to kill all their newborn sons. But Moses' parents instead hid their baby for 3 months and then set him in a papyrus basket and floated him among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. And when Pharaoh's daughter came down to the river, she saw the basket, discovered the baby boy, and felt sorry for him. And God worked the circumstances so that Pharaoh's daughter actually paid Moses' own mother to nurse him for her. And we read in Exodus chapter 2, verse 10, when the child grew older, his mother took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Now, the name Moses is an Egyptian name as well. It's not necessarily only a Hebrew name. It's also an Egyptian name. It means one who is born. When you look at the lines of pharaohs, you'll see that it was a common second and even third name for Amos, Thutmose. Even Ramses had the name Moses in there as well. So it's not only a Hebrew name, it's an Egyptian name. So Moses is playing both sides of the fence here. He's both Egyptian and Hebrew. And in Hebrew means to be drawn out. In Egyptian, it means to be one who is born. So for Moses, one who was born out of the water. Isn't that crazy? Now, I'm probably not the only one who's ever put those two together. But doesn't that have a ring to it for us as Christians? We are born out of the water. I don't think it was an accident that his name was Moses. Anyway, he was raised by by Pharaoh's daughter in the court of Egypt with all the privileges of power and rank that such a position could afford him. For example, we know Moses was extremely well educated. Acts chapter 7, verse 22 tells us that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So Moses would be proficient in science, in mathematics, in literature, in government, in law, in economics. He would have been multilingual. He would have known the Egyptian language. He would have known the Hebrew language. Because remember, he was with his mother for the first 2 years of his life. So he would have known that. And he would probably have known Aramaic, which would have been the language or the market. Even though they were slaves, they still could buy things. And so he would have known at least.
Sort of, but yeah, close enough. What size?
Possible more than that. And there's a great divine irony at work here when you look at the life of Moses. God arranged things so that Pharaoh's family actually raised and educated the very one who would deliver the Israelites from out of their midst. God's plan was for Moses to give Israel the law, to write it down, her early history. You know, I thought about this as I was preparing for this sermon. The first 40 years of Moses' life, he was spent in the palace. The first 2 years at home with his mother. But after that, 38 or so years in the palace, under Pharaoh's rule, learning all of the customs and the languages and the nuances of government, the nuances of being a prince, the nuance of one day becoming king. And then he spent 40 years after he killed the servant, after he killed the soldier, spent 40 years wandering around being a shepherd. I don't know if any of you know what a shepherd's job is, but it's basically sit up on a hillside and watch out over the flock for the majority of the day. Now, there involves moving them from field to field and protecting them from all these other things. But there's a whole lot of time where you're just sitting. You
need the spaces to be left.
And I wonder if Moses didn't write down some things that God told him to write down.
Let me look what's here, and then I'll come back up.
And then we have 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And yes, he is governing a people, but he has assigned judges and other things to take care of that. But he's got all this responsibility of leading God's people. And I wonder if for that 40-year period of time when he was a shepherd and that 40-year period of time when he was leading God's people, if he didn't take the time to write what we call the Torah. Now, some scholars would tell you that Moses didn't write but maybe a handful of verses, but he dictated it to other people and they wrote it, which is why you see different styles and why you see different things in there. Or that even Moses told all this. There was the oral Torah, and Moses just told all these stories, and then someone years and centuries later wrote all that down. I have to think that when I look at Moses and his life with God, I have to think, and this is just me, I'm persuaded of this. I'm not telling you you have to believe this. I have to think that during some of those lonely afternoons or lonely nights up on the hill watching the flocks, and some of those times when the people were just a little too overwhelming and Moses would need to retreat to his own tent and have Joshua outside watching them, I have to believe that there were times he wrote down the things that God had given him to write down, the history of God's people. Looking at Moses, he had it all. He had the best education that money could buy. He had power, he had influence, he had connections. He was the rich kid on the block. And according to Jewish tradition, Pharaoh had appointed Moses to be his heir. Now, I don't know how true that is, but can you imagine that? Moses is going to be Pharaoh. He's going to be the leader over the most powerful nation in the world. In fact, the center of the world at that time was Egypt. As far as power, wealth, education, they were it. But verse 24 says, when Moses had grown up, he refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Moses had a dilemma. Would I identify with Egypt or would I identify with Israel? And humanly speaking, Egypt had all the power. Israel had no power. They were powerless. They were slaves to the Egyptians. And it would have been easy for Moses to say, you know what, if I hold on just a little bit longer, I'm going to be Pharaoh, and then I can affect some change.
Probably 150 to
I know I'm going to be around this world of sin and this world of power and this world of I can have whatever I want. If I hang on just a little bit longer, then maybe I can release help my people get out of slavery, out of captivity. But he didn't.
You like he's got a piece of furniture that you're trying to do.
He said, I'm not going to succumb to the worldly temptation of having all this power, of having all this wealth, having this position.
Yeah.
I mean, identify with God's people.
It is just a box.
Moses knew where the power was and knew that God was on the side of Israel.
Yeah.
So he
Lumber's not going to cost you that much.
Pharaoh's daughter.
Excuse me a sec.
Faith refuses
Ready?
the temptation
Thank
of
you.
worldly
Give you the
power
card.
and influence.
Hey.
Faith also
You
recognizes
did. I have a question for you.
sin are only for a
I
season.
got an email from corporate that they had
Verse 25, he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short while. For Moses, the main sin here would have been the sin of choosing to identify with the people of Egypt rather than the people of Israel. And it must have been very tempting. The Israelites were underdogs here. Who would choose to identify with the slaves instead of the masters? And besides, as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, he had easy access to a life filled with
So there's a number of people I didn't bother to call because if they got
luxury.
they got paid correctly.
Yeah, the Bible tells us he chose to be
But I also know that you're usually on your
along
paychecks
with
like
the people of God
thank
rather
God.
than to enjoy the pleasures
Um,
for a short time. And I think there's an important lesson there for us.
It
Sin
was
often
from,
presents itself as pleasure.
and
Moses
they want me
didn't
to
deny that
sign
Egypt
something that
offered
says
pleasure,
it's okay. It was
but he
from
recognized that
Ali
those pleasures were temporary.
Bomb,
Even if Moses
overpayment
had
of
become ruler
wages,
over all
and
of
it
Egypt,
came
he
through
only got to
on
see it for a short
Friday
time.
at 1:30.
He would have enjoyed it for a season, a comfort, privilege, and then it would have been all over. And he would have ended up a mummy in some Egyptian
And my
tomb.
questions are,
May have
I
discovered
went
him
back and I
sometime.
looked at my pay. They're right. My paycheck should have been $2,100 and I got $3,000. So they cut me a check for my draw plus my commission, which is very nice of them. And I didn't know it at the time because I don't
There's not
match these
necessarily
two things
anything
up.
wrong with power in and of itself. It's
Yeah.
how you use that power. And it's the same thing with pleasure. There's nothing inherently wrong with pleasure. As a matter of fact, in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17, Paul
I
writes
also
this,
got one, this is
God,
quite a while ago, where
who
they
richly
underpaid
provides
me.
us with
That may be
everything
what you're talking
for
about.
our
And they cut me a
enjoyment. That
check
word
for,
could
I
be
don't know,
translated
$250
pleasure.
or so.
He provides everything for our pleasure.
It
God
doesn't
wants
give
us
me
to
any
have pleasure.
confidence in our payroll
But we
system
need to remember that
that
the pleasures of sin
in
are
a
fleeting. Who in
paycheck
here
from May, they're now catching
doesn't
an
agree
error.
that
How many
sin
other overs and
brings
unders have
pleasure?
gone past? It just,
If it didn't,
No,
we
not
wouldn't
fair.
want to do
But
it.
no, I looked like I
If
was
it didn't
either
bring a
under or
temporary
overpaid or
moment of pleasure, which like, you know what?
let
No.
me know.
right. And they, like I
As
said, they
Christians,
want
we
me to
understand
sign
that
an
when we sin,
authorization. I
we
was
may
curious
have that
what
temporary
sign
moment
it.
of pleasure, but we
That's a
have
question.
I've never
obtained
signed
on the other side
anything
of
they've
that,
ever asked me to sign in
from
7
the
years. So.
physical toll, from the
Bryce
emotional
just still
toll
working
it
here.
takes on us, from the
Oh,
spiritual
I do
toll
need
that it
you.
takes on us.
Amelia said you
We
had
can
like
enjoy it
workday
for a
off.
moment,
Yes, what'd you do? Actually, I said yes.
and later we
I will
understand
do that. Tell Ryan to
takes,
clock in
it
on
takes
time.
away from us. But God
No,
says,
I'm good. I just
I want you to have pleasure, but I want you to have pleasure and take pleasure in the right thing. When you look outside and you see the
PTO
trees,
or
you see the
PTO
birds,
or
you
sick
see the
days?
wind blowing through the trees, you see the leaves rustling, that should
Okay.
bring you pleasure.
that'd be for the.
When you look at all the awesome food that God has put together on this
You don't
planet, that
have
we have combined and created recipes that we
sick
can
days on
gather together and eat.
Friday, Saturday.
We should take pleasure in that. Now, I over pleasure
There's
myself
already 2
and
days
get the
approved.
second and third plate, but the first plate is
Right.
sufficient. God wants us to be pleased by that. When we have sexual
Riley
relations
said you were
with our
sick as a
mate,
dog.
God wants that to be pleasing. It's not intended to be ugly. God's intent was for that to
Yeah,
be
I mean,
beautiful,
I'll
bring
probably sign the
pleasure.
thing. They did overpay me, and I'm the kind of guy who
When
says,
we
yeah,
come
well,
together
that's
and
not
sing
right. You're not
songs
supposed
of
to
joy
overpay
and
me. On
sing
the other
songs
hand,
about God's
there's a
mercy,
part of me that
when we
says,
come
well, what
together
if I
and
never
we
sign
build
it?
each
Does
other
that
up,
mean that you
God
can't take
wants
it
us
out
to
of my
find
paycheck?
pleasure in that.
I mean, it's almost
God's not some
$900.
harsh God sitting up there with a cracking a whip. You know,
I
how
want to
dare
sign
you
it.
smile? Kapow.
You know, it just,
How dare you have fun? How dare you laugh?
I was talking to my wife last night about it. I said, so
Filled
if
with
they did
joy,
overpay me,
filled
the
with
right thing to do
these
would be to let
pleasures.
them take the money back out. On the other
King
hand,
David says this
it's
in
6
Psalm
months
16,
later.
verse
When
11.
does the statute of
You have made
limitations
known to
expire on
me the
something
path
like
of
this?
life.
4 days ago.
You will fill me with joy in your
It's like you came in
presence,
on the
with
125th day of your
eternal
120-day
pleasures
trial
at
period.
your right hand.
Sorry, you're
Yeah,
5 days past. Too bad.
All right, man.
Moses
Back to my
understood that
guest
the
now.
Okay, thanks,
pleasures
Mike.
of this earth are only temporary, but there's a pleasure that comes from being in heaven, from being in the presence of God. And that's the one I'm going to choose. I'm going to choose not to enjoy this and be pleased for just a while in this. I'm going to choose eternal pleasures in heaven with you. And see, faith is not distracted by worldly riches or wealth. In verse 26, he says he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. The temptation for Moses here were the treasures of Egypt. During Moses' time, it's reported that Egypt was the richest nation in the world. This was sometime what some archaeologists would say was the 18th dynasty, which was the richest and most lush of the Egyptian dynasties, when gold seemed to be pouring out of every vessel that they could find, that the food was abundant, that herds were abundant. Even the slaves, when you look at the time of Moses, when they were in slavery, they were having so many children so fast that the Egyptians couldn't even keep up with all of it. Bounty everywhere. And when you read when they took off out of Egypt, they looted the Egyptians. They had more than they could carry. They had more clothing, they had more gold, they had more equipment than they could carry. And Egypt was never the same after that. The temptation for him were the treasures of Egypt. You ask yourself, and I ask myself, why would he turn that down? I mean, that sounds pretty good to me. And I'd like to have a basin to wash my face that was made of gold. I'd like to be able to pour the water into that basin out of a pitcher made with gold. And I'd like to have a gold fork and knife and spoon to eat the food off of my golden plate that was served to me on my golden tray. But it says Moses did something. He looked ahead. It's to turn your eyes away from one thing in order to fix your attention on something else. Moses took his eyes off of the gold prize here and he put his eyes on the eternal prize in heaven. Moses had lived long enough to understand that moth and rust will destroy all of this, that these things are temporary. But this thing that God has built, as the Hebrew writer has told us in other places about Abraham, he looked to that eternal prize. He looked to that city that was not built with human hands. He was looking to that city that was built with God's hands, by God, that would never fade away, that would never pass away, that would be eternal. And that's what Moses is doing. He's looking past all this wonderful, he's the most powerful man in the country with the most money of anybody in the country. And he says, I'm going to get rid of that. And I know that Pharaoh's daughter has raised me, and I know that she's treated me well, and I know that I'm only alive because of her mercy and her grace, that she pulled me out of that river. I only have these things. I've only been educated, and I only have this, and I have all these friends in this position because of her tenderness, because of her compassion, and yet I'm going to reject that because there's something even greater. And Moses chose the greater. When we look at the reward, the Hebrew writer tells us that it is the purification for sins in chapter 1, verse 3. He tells us it's salvation in chapter 2, verse 3. He tells us that it's God's rest in chapter 4. The reward is eternal salvation according to chapter 5, verse 9. That it's eternal redemption according to 9:12. Eternal, 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 eternal. Purity. God's rest. Greater than all the gold that you can mount into a heap. Greater than all the fine silk clothing. Greater than all the education. Greater than the position of power of being the most powerful man in the known world. God's rewards are greater. There's another theme here. Faith chooses to identify with Christ and his people no matter the consequences. As Christians, we don't merely refuse identification with the world, but we also choose to identify with Christ. And when we look at the word Christian, it actually means a Christ one who follows after or identifies with Christ. I had a buddy tell me the first time I'd ever heard this was in preaching school. Do you know what the letters IAN stand for after Christ? Without Christ, I ain't nothing. He was a redneck from Georgia. I love that brother. Without Christ, I ain't nothing. You cannot identify with the world and Christ at the same time. You can't have it both ways. Moses understood that. And he was probably tempted far beyond anything that most of us are going to be tempted with. Nobody's come to me and said, David, I'd like you to be the second most powerful person in the world next to Pharaoh. And guess what? When he dies, or president or king or whoever, once this person dies, you're next in line. Oh, and by the way, here's your bank account. It give you a black card. If anybody knows any familiarity with credit cards, if they give you a black card, that means you can spend whatever you want. There's no limit. If something costs $2 million, I just whip out the card and it's paid for. If something costs $100 million, all I've got to do is sign my name on it. It's mine. I've not been tempted with those things. But I've been tempted with, should I really have that extra piece of chicken? And I had half of that Snickers candy bar. Should I really have the second half of that candy bar? I have an opportunity to cheat on my taxes and save myself a few $1,000s. Should I go ahead and scribble that line, take that extra? Moses knew that he had to make a choice. He couldn't straddle the fence. He couldn't live with one foot in Egypt and one foot in Israel. he had to plant both feet firmly with God's people or not at all. Because you see, faith willingly suffers persecution. One of the great things we talked about in our class this morning, Paul, when he's writing this letter to the Philippians, is in prison. He's being persecuted. There are people who are preaching the gospel in order to get him in more trouble. And Paul said, that's all right. I'll suffer the persecution. Moses chose to identify with God's people no matter what the consequences. Verse 25, let's read that again. He says, he, being Moses, chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. Another way we put our faith into action is by choosing to identify with the correct people, even though it may mean persecution. The phrase along with the people of God is interesting to me because it doesn't say along with the people of Israel. When we identify with the people of Israel, we're making a national identification. When we say we are Americans, we're making a national identification. Moses said, in this writing here, the Hebrew writer says he chose to identify with the people of God. That's a spiritual identification. He's saying, I am choosing God over the country. I'm choosing God over Egypt. I'm choosing God over gold. I'm choosing God over wealth and power and sin. I'm choosing to be a part of God's people. And God's people, as we read the story of Moses, are about to be persecuted. 40 years he goes out there and tends sheep, and then God says, hey, Moses, I have a job for you. It's time to go back and bring my people out. I hear their cry. It's time for you to deliver them. And Moses, and he tried to get out of that a couple of times, didn't he? But I can't. I don't know how. I don't know how to talk. I don't know if that was his speech impediment or not. But I often think of Bobby Boucher from The Waterboy whenever I think of this particular scene with Moses. Moses tried to get out of that. He said, anybody but me. And God said, no, it's you. And your people are about to be persecuted. When you were born, Moses, 80 years ago, you were being persecuted. Your people were being killed. Your brothers and sisters, in your national brothers and sisters, were being thrown into the Nile River where the crocodiles eat them, where they would drown. They would become fish bait and crocodile bait. You were persecuted then. In 40 years, even though you were in Pharaoh's house, you killed a soldier, you were about to be prosecuted and persecuted. You chose to flee. And I used that time, Moses, to get rid of some of that temper that you had, to make you more mild and meaningful in your presentation. And then when you come back, there's going to be a whole lot of suffering in Egypt. There's going to be an intense amount of suffering in Egypt with the plague after plague after plague after plague that affects everybody. And Moses said, I'm willing to do that. I will identify with you, God, because I understand there's an eternal reward. There's a spiritual reward. You see, faith regards disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than worldly riches. Paul, as we talked about this morning, understood that him being in prison was of greater value to the kingdom of God being preached than it was for him to be out and running about. And either way, he says, if I die tomorrow or if I live, it's going to be great because I understand the value of preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. How did Moses identify with Christ? How did Moses identify with the people of Christ? That was a concept that I don't think had been introduced, or maybe it was through the covenant in the garden, but he's 1,400 years or so, maybe 1,500 years away. Did God give him a vision? Well, here's my son Jesus, and he's going to die on the cross, and I'm going to give you that vision. He may have. We're not told that anywhere that he does or doesn't. I don't think he did. I think what the Hebrew writer is saying, in the same way that Moses chose God, you who are getting ready to go back to Moses chose Christ in a very real sense. Moses chose to suffer with Christ. And you who are being persecuted, you're ready to go back to the law of Moses. He says, don't. Because Moses didn't even identify with that. Moses identified with the suffering of Christ. And you hold on to that, even though there's going to be suffering. Now, Nero could have taken the heads off of hundreds of them, thousands of them at his whim, and he did. Paul, James, and John, and all the others, those who are not mentioned, who gathered in homes from week to week, day to day, said, you know what? I'm going to choose that rather than choose worldly pleasure. Because you see, it wasn't any different for them at that time. They could have said, you know what? I renounce Christ, and I renounce this religion called the Way, and now I can go spend my money in the marketplace. I can have a job in the marketplace. I can have back my position of power, my position of authority. I can have my wealth back. And I can be looked upon by the people of the world who say, you know what? You look good to me now. You're all right. But the Christians, the people who followed Christ, and Christ himself, Christ was in heaven. He stepped out of heaven in order to be persecuted, in order to be killed. Moses says, I want to identify with that guy. I want to identify with this persecution, because even though it's coming, it has a greater value than what the world offers. Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. We find this story in Acts chapter 9. Well, how was Saul persecuting Jesus? Because Saul was persecuting the church. Jesus so closely identifies with the church, he calls it a part of him. You are persecuting me. When you persecute the church, you're persecuting me. The Hebrew writer is telling you cannot let go of Christ to go back to Moses. Because Moses even chose to identify with Christ. He didn't know exactly what it was that he was going to identify with, but that was his choice to follow God. Because of a verse later, it'll tell us that by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. And remember what our faith has been about the whole time when we talk about faith? The reality of goods hoped for, the proof of things unseen. Moses chose faith in God. He chose faith in believing what God said, that in spite of all the persecution and prosecution, in spite of all the wandering, in spite of all the headache that you're going to have, in spite of, in time, Moses, you won't even be able to go into the promised land because you got angry and you give me the glory on one event. I've been leading these people, these stubborn people, for 40 years. And I even stood up and said, you know what, God, why don't you kill me and let them live? Take me. And that one event at the end, and God says, nope. Moses said, I'm good with that. That's okay with me, because I understand the eternal, not the temporal. Because I understand the spiritual and not the national. Moses made his choice. He could no longer identify with the people of Egypt. He must identify with the people of God. We too live in a world that's opposed to God. And like Moses, we have to make a choice. Are you going to choose to identify with Christ and his people? Or will you choose to identify with the world? If you choose to identify with Christ, we invite you to come forward this morning, give your life to him, to receive the reward that Moses so longed for. God's rest, God's salvation, God's forgiveness of sins, eternal redemption, eternal forgiveness. That's what I choose this morning. And I hope you do the same. I believe Mike has a song for us. We're going to offer that invitation. If you have an opportunity or a need to come, we ask you to do so. Mike's going to lead us in a song. Let's be standing as we sing.